Hi, I'm Joe, and my news analysis was on Brexit and its employment implications. First off, I'm sorry if the TV is a little bit hard to read from the video. Hopefully, you can follow along in the slides as I talk if it's not good enough. So, it's kind of important to have a fundamental understanding of what Brexit is and some of its causes before we dive into some of the news analysis of Brexit. So in June of 2016, the people of Britain collectively voted to leave the EU. There were many reasons for this. A few of them included that they wanted more sovereignty over their governing power and laws and not following EU mandates. They also had a lot of worries about immigration that included racial tensions from potential new EU countries that might be able to immigrate to the Britain based off of freedom of immigration between EU member states, and also fear of those foreigners taking native jobs. So they hope that with less immigration, there'd be more jobs for British people, and that hopefully those wages would increase. They also hope that Brexit would help protect the British economy, which was thriving, from other potential countries in the EU that might have economic crisis and drag down the British economy with it. On the contrary, there were a lot of Brits that voted to stay also in the Brexit vote. They were afraid of the potential impacts of workers from other EU countries, especially seasonal workers, that impacted them working in the UK. And they're also worried about the impact that Brexit would have on UK workers working elsewhere in the EU. So we get to the news analysis. So what does the media expect the audience to know? First off, they expect the audience to know what Brexit is and some of the reasons for Brexit, which we just covered on the last slide. They also expect the audience to know some industries in Britain that are very reliant upon foreign labor. So some of these industries might include farming or other agriculture industries or fishing or the hotel industries. Mostly unskilled jobs. You can probably think of a lot of these jobs also in the US that have a lot of foreign people doing them. All right, and then we get to how the media is portraying Brexit. So in a study done by Oxford, there was a meta-analysis of all the news articles written about Brexit in the UK, and it found that overall the reporting was neutral and fact-based. When there was a position taken, it was mostly negative and critical about the decision to leave the EU. So is there a bias in this media? Overall, like the Oxford study said, it's mostly fact-based, but there are a lot of, especially in the media, there's a lot of pundits and editorials written where the authors or speakers might input their own opinions. So here's a couple of examples where that might have happened, as an editorial from The Guardian, where it mentions how even though unemployment has decreased since the Brexit vote, it's been replaced by mostly part-time workers and lower wages, mostly tentative work type things. There was a pundit arguing about the economics on Brexit, saying what's wrong with the proposal, and how it fools ordinary people into thinking that Brexit stuff is easy, pretty much saying his opinion that he thinks Brexit is complicated and shouldn't happen. And there's also even comedians that have their input on Brexit, like James Corden, who says he hopes that the Brexit vote, he hoped that the Brits would vote to remain in the EU, and even though he's not really a British news source, He is in the British media and is very influential, and his opinion does matter and helps shape public opinion. So, like I said, overall, when there is an opinion in the British media, it seems to be very critical and precautious. So, the first example I have of that is with the seasonal workers. So, it's becoming more difficult for UK employers to recruit seasonal workers, and this has to do with obviously Brexit, the threat that the seasonal workers might not be have legal residency in England or elsewhere in the UK after Brexit goes through. An example might be in the hotel industry. Some 40% of workers are from other EU countries. Also in the farming industry, it could be up above 95%, where workers are foreign seasonal workers. Or it could even have in other industries that don't even have to do, or that, in other industries that have skilled labor, not unskilled labor, like vets at slaughterhouses, where 90% of the vets are from elsewhere in Europe. Next, I have a video clip portraying some of the example of the agriculture industry. If I can get it to work. We'll just watch a minute of this.
Lives. It's a job British workers just don't want to do. 0.6% of seasonal agricultural workers in the UK are British. 0.6%. Almost everyone else is Eastern European. But the lack of clarity
Over
around
98%
Brexit
are from
has
Eastern
sown
Europe.
doubt in these fields. Many of the pickers here question whether they themselves will be the last crop. Alina started as a picker in these fields 8 years ago. She's now the harvest manager.
They have families they need to take care for, they rely on the income from here. And if we can't provide them with that security they're looking for, they will find somewhere else a job.
Is that already happening? People looking elsewhere?
Yes, it does. We've lost some people since last year. They moved in different other countries in EU.
They have options, but this is their
Yeah, so it pretty much shows that the people in England don't want to do these types of jobs that are done by the foreigners. It's seen as lower status, just uninspiring or undesired jobs that foreigners might do. Not that it's necessarily underpaid compared to other maybe part-time jobs, but it's undesired. And if there are no foreigners, then someone has to pick up this industry, or else it could potentially disappear. Another thing that this news article shows very well is it puts a face to the problem, which I'll use as many more examples later. It interviews specific people that the problem, the Brexit impacts. It's not just numbers, it shows actual people, and therefore it shows, therefore the news articles can be seen as kind of critical and precautious in protecting these kind of people. So another example of where a whole bunch of news articles can be critical is I found a bunch of news articles about Brits working abroad, and these news articles were very critical of Brexit and the Leave group, of their impact of these British people. There's over 1 million Brits working in the UK, but if living outside the EU, but if the UK leaves the EU, those Brits will be on an uneven playing field with other EU citizens who can move freely between countries to find jobs, whereas as they might have to either apply for a work permit or even return to the UK. And also, if all these million people return to the UK, that could have even bigger impact than the flood of foreigners flooding to the UK for jobs, especially because many of these British workers are skilled workers. So you'd have an influx of a lot of skilled workers trying to take jobs away from people who already have skilled workers. So there's more impacts about the re-entry of Brits. And again, there's a bunch of news articles that put a face to the problem. They blame the out-of-touch conservatives who are waging their own war against Brexit. These business owners are in areas of like travel agencies or ski resorts or just any other job in Europe that the news will put a face to. And because they put a face to it, it shows how it's very critical of Brexit, not solely, even though it is fact-based, it plays on emotions also. Another problem that the news brings up with Brexit is xenophobia and potential racial tensions that can arise because of Brexit. It does this through a lot of statistics, saying more than 6,000 incidents of hate crime have been reported in the first month after Brexit happened. And there's also a bunch of news segments. For example, I found a radio broadcast from BBC about an Iranian doctor that was asked when she was going to go home because this wasn't her country anymore after the Brexit vote. Again, this is another personal example that the media uses to shed some light on the negative side of Brexit. Sometimes the numbers that the supporters use don't share the whole story, but stories like this, or in the other examples of Brits abroad or seasonal workers in Britain, shed a larger picture on the effects of Brexit outside of just the numbers. So another thing that the media does a lot of is, besides just being critical of Brexit and saying what's wrong and reporting the facts, is another big part of the media has been providing recommendations, potential solutions to Brexit. So I found a lot of solutions from news articles, and here's some of them. So one common one was in the BBC clip. It said that they could use regional visas to attract workers to less populated areas. So the example that they used in that case was in Cornwall. The fishing industry is largely run by foreign workers. So you could use a visa to import, or not, but allow the immigration of a certain amount of foreign workers into just the fishing industry in just the Cornwall area. So those foreigners would be limited to a specific industry in a specific region, so that they don't compete with Brits for their jobs. Another example of a solution provided by the media would be, in the case of the agriculture industry, is if they don't have foreign workers, is they could just limit domestic farming altogether and just import cheaper food from developing countries. Another solution recommendation that the media presented was not just allowing visas to a specific industry or area, but just overall allowing a specific number of EU workers to be allowed into the UK each year. They could work in any industry, but a specific cap would be placed. However, the news articles also would respond to their own recommendations or other news articles' recommendations. For example, they said that in the case of allowing limited number of workers, it could create an underground economy where migrants are exploited because there's only a limited number of them. And then there's even responses from organizations like Flex, which is the focus on labor exploitation, and they would respond with an official response to these news articles, saying their recommendation is to ensure safe standards and avoid exploitation of the workers. And even though Flex isn't official news article per se, its response does validify the recommendations made by these news articles, showing how important and influential the articles are that they would have to respond to it. These